When most violin students are working out their technique, they tend to focus a lot more on what's happening in the left hand as opposed to the bow arm. And this is understandable. After all, when you watch a violinist, your eyes are much more naturally drawn to what's happening over the fingerboard. But I would argue that this is a misappropriation of priorities. If you're not going to focus on each side equally, then you should actually put a little bit more emphasis on what's happening in your bow arm. Bow technique is, after all, a lot more subtle, a lot less obvious on what should happen, and takes a lot longer to develop properly and has a much larger impact on your playing generally. So that's what we're going to help you with today. I'm Tobiah Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. First off, like, comment, subscribe, and merch. And of course, the best way to develop your bow arm is to work with a competent private teacher, and that is what we do here at Murphy Music Academy. So if you're interested in either live or video chat lessons, then shoot an email to admin@murphymusicacademy.org or fill out a form at murphymusicacademy.org. Links will be in the description below. Rule number 1. All, or at least almost all bow strokes should be initiated from the elbow. Now, the two exceptions to this rule right off the bat would be very fast strokes, which need to be done with the wrist, and of course that last little portion of the bow from the balance point to the frog that often has to be finished with the shoulder. But other than that, and those are two very small motions, for proper bowing technique, everything needs to come from the elbow. You want to do basic DETACHÉ? You're going to want to be moving from your elbow. You want to do good sounding marcato? You're going to want to be moving from your elbow. You want to play those chords in preludium and allegro? You're also going to want to be moving mostly from your elbow. The most obvious reason for this is that this is the easiest and most efficient way to keep the bow straight. Most people will remember, if you're not still in the stage of learning, the first few pieces in violin music and trying not to move from the shoulder like this, so your bow ends up getting crooked. If you start with the bow nice and straight and then you move with just the elbow, you're going to be able to keep the bow a lot straighter with a lot more ease. And for reasons that I will probably go into in another video, straight bow is paramount to quality sound production. Another advantage to using primarily the elbow when moving the bow as opposed to the shoulder, because that's the only other joint you can actually use. Anything from here down is just going to be too small to move the entire bow. One of the advantages of moving from the elbow, not the shoulder, is that you're going to stay a lot looser. And being loose is another thing that also helps with sound production. If you're constantly tense because you have to move this big muscle back and forth this way to use the bow, well, you're going to wear out and also not have as much control because, well, besides the fact that using big muscles is not ideal for violin playing, it also is going to get tired really easy, which means you're not going to have as much control over the bow. Also, as you start to get into more advanced bowing techniques like spiccato or anything else which involves a kind of throwing the bow towards the string, if you move primarily from your shoulder, you're going to actually be throwing the bow at a bit of an angle this way, which is going to be a lot less efficient and a lot less reliable in terms of getting a good, consistent quality sound than if you throw the bow straight down and across, which you would do with your elbow. I mean, this is a lot more tiring besides not sounding as good than this. It seems like such a simple thing, but you'd be surprised how often I've worked with people that as they started to play more difficult music, they didn't realize that they didn't have complete control over their elbow. As they, it's one thing to be able to play, the twinkle variations using only your elbow. It's another thing to have that kind of subtle, complete control over tiny movements happening in your elbow, initiating each bow stroke as opposed to your shoulder. So if you're starting to have some issues with more complicated bowing techniques, then I would suggest this be something that maybe you revisit and make sure that you are doing for every single bow stroke. Unless, of course, they're fast ones with the wrist, but we talked about that earlier. Rule number 2, and this is related, but the bow shoulder must remain down. Now, I've talked about the dreaded trapezius muscle many times on this channel, and I'm sure I will do it again, because it is that much of a problem in people's bow arms. And very often, people don't even realize it, because you don't actually have to raise your shoulder that much. You can just get this involved, this muscle right here, by the way, can get this involved just a little bit, and it can cause problems in your bow arm. Anytime you start to play with a raised trapezius muscle, you start to get a little bit tense. You can start to get knots in your back. You can start to get pinched nerves. And the other side of this is also the trapezius muscle is a very strong muscle. You can lift a lot of weight shrugging your shoulders. And besides all of the other negative things I mentioned, strong, big muscles are not ideal for all of the delicate things we need to do in violin playing. So it's best if this right here just kind of stays out of your bow arm. What you want to do is make sure that this part of your shoulder just sits here. What I like to say is it just sits on your rib cage. For some people, they've got such tension here, they actually have to work on actively stretching out their neck and shoulder while they play as they do bowing exercises. But whatever it takes, you want to make sure for smooth and quality bowing, you want to make sure that you keep your shoulder down. Now, the place where this is going to become the most apparent is as you get closer to the frog. This is where your arm and your brain starts to sense, it's getting heavier down here. I've got to use those big muscles to pick it up. So it's actually very useful to practice just playing here at the frog to the balance point, or maybe from the middle to the frog like this, actively working on trying to quiet down the trapezius muscle and learn to balance the bow and control the weight of the bow much more in your fingers. Rule number 3. The bow arm motion should be essentially two-dimensional. Aside from, raising the shoulder and not moving from the elbow, one of the things I've often worked with people on that have trouble doing a smooth, simple bow stroke is that they tend to have a lot of motion in the bow stroke that goes up and down instead of just straight across. The most common manifestation of this problem is when people start a stroke at the frog and they may have their shoulder down, they may be moving from the elbow, but if they start the stroke with a bit of a motion that goes down as well as opening the arm instead of just opening the arm, they're going to destabilize the bow stroke and it's not going to be smooth. It might even skitter as they go towards the tip. There are also times where people don't have their arm stabilized and they can be moving their elbow up and down, not moving the bow on a two-dimensional path, and this will also make them not have as smooth of a sound. You see, in violin, to produce the best sound, you want to use the simplest motion possible. Any extra motion is not just superfluous, it usually actually detracts or makes the sound you're wanting to produce worse. And even if it didn't, it would take away energy that you could be putting into your playing. So this might not be something that you think is that common, but let me tell you, it actually is. And if you've double-checked the other things we've talked about with keeping your shoulder down and making sure that you're moving from your elbow and you're still having trouble making a nice smooth sound, this might be something you want to check in on. Rule number 4. The elbow should generally not be higher than the wrist. Generally, we want to feel like our bow arm and bow is just kind of sitting on the string. We don't want to ever feel like we're hovering the bow on the string, and the more it just feels like it's sitting there, the looser and smoother our bow strokes will be. And from what I've found, the best position of the arm in relation to the bow, in relation to the bow hand, is actually to keep the elbow a little bit lower than the wrist, or at the very least at parallel level. So typically, I think for most people, as you see here, my arm is still following what is generally a straight line from my elbow about to my hand. There might be a little bit of a bend in my wrist, but I'm not going in like this, so I'm not really clamped in or cramped, and I'm also not going like this, so I'm not raising unnecessarily and pushing the bow down. So here it's a nice, very relaxed, and I think very ergonomic position for the bow arm. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, and I thought the same thing, but Tobiah, what about sharing? What you'll actually notice here when you watch this sharing clip is that sharing, though he does keep his elbow what I would consider abnormally high, certainly higher than most violinists even of his era, he still actually keeps the elbow at least parallel with the wrist, and at the times where it seems that his elbow is higher than his wrist, well, if you did this, you'd actually notice that that's just because he's leaning over. Now, in the interest of full transparency, there are actually a couple of spots, even in this video, that Sering's elbow does go a little bit above his wrist, but it is very rare, mostly when he's playing at the frog on the G string, and also it is only very, very slight. In general, he actually does follow this rule quite closely, mostly just keeping his elbow about parallel with his wrist. That being said, I would like to point out what I said in my video on why you should not emulate your favorite artists. There are general rules and guidelines that every violinist should be following when they are learning to play the violin. As you get better and as you start to know yourself and the violin a lot better, you might actually be able to tweak some of these rules in a way that works best for you. But in general, I'm going to tell you what I tell most of my private students when they ask me about certain artists that maybe do things a little bit more idiosyncratic, which is, if you can sound like Sering, then you can play however you want. However, until then, you're going to be better off following these rules. In any case, what holding your elbow above your wrist is going to end up doing, even if you hold it in such a way that does not raise or activate the trapezius muscle, is still going to put you in a position of tension and is also going to make all of the pressure that you put onto the strings a much more muscular pressure instead of a distribution of weight throughout the arm and therefore into the bow, which is going to be much more difficult to control and is not going to produce as good of a sound. Also, the motion that you're able to do from this position or even this position is not going to be as fluid or as easy to control as motion you do from the much more natural position like this. Now, last but certainly not least, rule number 5. Bow control is all about momentum. Now, what I mean by this is actually much more of a mental thing, but it is something that I found has helped everyone that I've worked with in their bow control. So the idea of momentum is that once the bow stroke gets started, you want to feel like the bow is kind of moving on its own and you are along for the ride. And the most important aspect of this is actually not when you're doing fast bow, but when you're doing slow bow. If you're going to try to do what they call sans filet, or sort of, I think the English translation in some of the books I had was called spun bows, where you just basically try to do as slow of a bow as possible, it becomes often very difficult for people when they get to the frog because they feel like I have to control, and it just shakes like crazy. The real way to do this is to almost put what I call putting on sort of mental blinders, where you just kind of want to, now obviously this is not physically how it works, you are physically moving the bow, but mentally you want to feel like, okay, the bow's just going and I'm just going to let it happen. And that's how people are able to do very controlled, slow bows all the way to the frog. Most notably, I think people find, their first introduction to this when playing the very first Kreutzer exercise. way I'm able to do that is that instead of thinking I've got to control every little part of the bow, got to make sure it doesn't get too heavy, got to make sure it doesn't get too light, got to make sure it moves exactly the right speed. Well, that kind of thinking, which is, I've been there and I know you probably have too, that actually produces a lot of tension in your arm instead of just kind of allowing the bow to move. It takes some experimenting and it takes some getting used to and learning how to do it, but once you actually learn how to do this and get the sense of momentum in your bow arm, it actually makes things a lot easier. Like you'll suddenly realize, wait, this was here the whole time and I didn't realize it? Wow, this is a lot easier than I thought. So one of the best ways to start practicing this is to just do long bows from frog to tip, and like I've said before, frog is here, not here, and tip is here, not here. For long bows from frog to tip in what I call a waltz tempo. So you want to think 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. And the reason why the waltz tempo is so important, one, it's takes long enough so you're not doing super fast bows, because that's a whole other issue that you have to worry about. But it's also not so long that you can't feel a natural sense of momentum. And it being in 3 for whatever reason and not sort of a square 4, I just feel like mentally and emotionally people get a sense of roundness and motion and momentum more from that. So that's what I've had a lot of success with in my teaching, is having people do long bows feeling 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, and just getting that sense of things. And then from there, when somebody gets the feeling of a nice smooth longbow in a waltz tempo, then it's pretty easy to start messing around with doing really slow, however slow you want, controlled momentum-based bowing from there on. Anyway, this has been my 5 basic rules for violin bowing technique, here to help you master probably the most important aspect of learning to play the violin. I've been Tobias Murphy for Murphy Music Academy, always reminding you there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.